Some of the most dangerous narcissists don't look arrogant. They look intelligent, articulate, insightful. They can read a room in seconds. They understand psychology. They speak about growth, awareness, and emotional intelligence. And somehow, around them, you slowly begin to doubt your own perception. That is the paradox. Narcissism is often imagined as loud self-importance, but the darker form hides behind competence and charm. It hides behind wit, behind confidence, behind the ability to mirror exactly what you value. And if you are someone who is emotionally intense, cognitively deep, or constantly questioning yourself, you are especially vulnerable to its subtlety. Because this kind of narcissist doesn't overpower you, they outthink you. The core conflict begins here. Intelligence can be used to understand others, or it can be used to control how others understand themselves. The narcissistic person with high cognitive ability doesn't simply crave admiration. They crave narrative dominance. They want to shape how reality is interpreted, not just by others, but by you. And if you are already someone who overthinks, who analyzes social dynamics, who wonders whether you are too sensitive or too much, their presence feels destabilizing. You begin to second-guess your own reactions, not because you lack intelligence, but because they weaponize theirs. At the center of dark narcissism is a fragile self-concept, not insecurity in the obvious sense, not visible self-doubt, but a deep instability in identity formation. Their sense of self is externally regulated. It depends on being superior, admired, or at least perceived as more perceptive than others. Intelligence becomes the perfect camouflage. They speak in frameworks. They reference psychological concepts. They seem self-aware. But this self-awareness is often cognitive, not emotional. They can describe attachment styles without feeling empathy. They can analyze your trauma without holding space for it. They can articulate boundaries while violating yours in subtle ways. This is the first mechanism: cognitive empathy without emotional empathy. Cognitive empathy is the ability to understand what someone else is feeling. Emotional empathy is the ability to resonate with it. The narcissistic mind can read you with precision. It can detect your insecurities, your ambitions, your fears of not belonging. But instead of meeting those with care, it stores them as leverage. Behaviorally, this looks like mirroring. Early on, they reflect your values back to you. If you value intelligence, they emphasize their intellect. If you value emotional depth, they perform vulnerability. If you value independence, they present as self-sufficient and boundary-aware. You feel seen. But what you are actually experiencing is strategic alignment. Over time, this mirroring shifts. The admiration phase transitions into subtle correction. Your insights become slightly less accurate than theirs. Your memory of events becomes a bit distorted. Your emotional reactions become overreactions. They rarely attack directly. They reframe. And if you are someone who already questions yourself, this is disorienting. The second mechanism is narrative control through intellectual superiority. For many narcissistic individuals, especially those who are intelligent, the battlefield is not emotional confrontation. It is interpretation. They don't need to shout. They redefine. You bring up a concern, they turn it into a philosophical debate. You describe hurt. They analyze your cognitive bias. You try to express a boundary. They question your consistency. The result is cognitive overload. Your brain starts working overtime. You replay conversations. You search for logical inconsistencies. You try to construct airtight arguments to justify your feelings. You begin to feel mentally exhausted, not because you are irrational, but because you are being pulled into constant meta-analysis. For highly sensitive or intellectually intense individuals, this is especially draining. You value accuracy. You value coherence. You want to be fair, so you overcorrect. You scrutinize yourself harder than they ever have to. Meanwhile, their identity remains intact, superior, unchallenged. The third mechanism is status-based self-worth regulation. At the psychological core of narcissism lies unstable self-esteem. But instead of collapsing inward, It compensates outward. The narcissistic person must feel above, not equal. Equal feels unsafe. Equality implies vulnerability, so they unconsciously create hierarchies. Subtle ones. In relationships, they position themselves as the more rational one, the more composed one, the more evolved one. In work environments, they subtly undermine peers by highlighting intellectual gaps. In social groups, they become the central interpreter of ideas. They don't just want attention, they want altitude. If you are someone who already feels different, who struggles with belonging, this dynamic is confusing. At first, their confidence feels stabilizing. They seem decisive where you hesitate, certain where you question. Over time, that certainty becomes a ceiling. Your growth begins to feel threatening to them. And this is where the charm hardens. Because when you begin to assert yourself, the narcissistic psyche experiences this as destabilization. Your independence disrupts their internal hierarchy. So they re-establish control through subtle invalidation, strategic withdrawal, or intellectual one-upmanship. The fourth mechanism is intermittent validation. One of the most psychologically binding experiences is unpredictability. When validation is consistent, you feel secure. When it is absent, you detach. But when it is intermittent, sometimes admiration, sometimes coldness, your nervous system becomes hyper-focused. You start scanning for cues. What version of them will I get today? For individuals who are emotionally intense or prone to rumination, this unpredictability becomes a cognitive trap. You replay interactions. You try to decode patterns. You believe that if you understand the logic behind their shifts, you can restore stability. But the instability is the mechanism. Intermittent validation maintains power. When they praise you, it feels earned. When they withdraw, you assume responsibility. You attempt to optimize yourself. You become smaller in areas that trigger them. You amplify traits they approve of. Gradually, your identity compresses. The fifth mechanism is moral reframing. Intelligent narcissists rarely position themselves as villains. They position themselves as principled. They speak about standards, about logic, about efficiency, about self-respect. When they distance themselves, it is framed as protecting energy. When they criticize, it is constructive. When they dominate conversations, it is clarity. The language is reasonable, but the emotional impact is destabilizing. You begin to feel excessive, dramatic, less rational. And because you value growth, you internalize their feedback. You adjust. You attempt to become more grounded, more concise, more emotionally regulated. But the standard keeps shifting. Over time, relationships with this kind of narcissism create specific psychological consequences. Your metacognition increases, but not in a healthy way. You become hyper-aware of your own tone, wording, logic. You rehearse conversations in advance. You preempt criticism. You dilute your intensity to avoid triggering superiority responses. In work settings, you may find yourself over-preparing around them. In social groups, you may feel subtly diminished. In intimate relationships, you may oscillate between admiration and exhaustion. Your self-esteem doesn't collapse dramatically. It erodes quietly. And this is what makes it so confusing for people who pride themselves on intelligence. You think, if I'm perceptive, why didn't I see this earlier? The answer is not lack of intelligence. It is misdirected trust. You assumed that cognitive sophistication implied emotional maturity. It doesn't. Dark narcissism thrives in environments where intelligence is valued more than integrity, where articulation substitutes for accountability, where being right matters more than being relational. But here is the deeper reframe. Narcissistic behavior is not evidence that you are naive. It is evidence that you are relationally oriented. You expect coherence between words and behavior. You expect intelligence to serve connection. When someone uses it to dominate, your system tries to reconcile the contradiction. Your confusion is not weakness. It is a sign that you assume good faith. The key psychological shift is not to become cynical. It is to differentiate intelligence from character. Cognitive ability tells you how well someone can process information. Character tells you what they do with that ability. When you begin to observe this distinction, the dynamic changes. You stop debating your own perception. You pay attention to patterns instead of arguments. You notice how you feel after interactions. Not just what was said, but what was implied. Not just the logic, but the relational temperature. Integration, not superiority, becomes the measure. You do not need to outthink a narcissist. You need to step out of the intellectual arena they control. When every conflict becomes a philosophical debate, your emotional truth gets sidelined. The reframe is simple but profound. Emotional impact is data, not something to be litigated. When someone uses intelligence as a shield against vulnerability, you will feel it. Not immediately, but gradually. And when you recognize that pattern, you are not diagnosing them. You are reclaiming yourself. It is discernment. The moment you stop trying to win the argument and start trusting the pattern, the spell weakens. Not dramatically, quietly.